When Maya Rodriguez pulled 17-year-old Alexander Hartford from the flames that consumed the east wing of Hartford Manor, she had no idea that her act of courage would become the catalyst for the most extraordinary transformation of her life. As smoke filled her lungs and heat seared her skin, the 19-year-old janitor's daughter didn't think about rewards or recognition. She thought only of saving a life, of doing what was right, even as the mansion's grand chandelier crashed behind them in a symphony of shattered crystal and burning timber. But sometimes, the universe has a way of rewarding those who act not from self-interest but from the purest depths of human compassion. The night of the Hartford Manor fire would be remembered by the media as a tragic accident that destroyed millions of dollars in art and antiques. But for Maya, it would become the night her real life began. As she carried Alexander's unconscious form across the manicured lawn, his designer clothes singed and his face streaked with soot, she couldn't have imagined that within 24 hours, everything she thought she knew about her world, her family, and her future would be turned upside down. The girl who had spent her entire life invisible in the shadows of wealth would discover that sometimes the most profound changes come not from what we seek, but from what finds us when we're simply trying to be human. In that moment, as paramedics took Alexander from her trembling arms, and his father, Richard Hartford, looked at her with eyes full of gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite identify, Maya thought her part in this story was over. She had done her good deed, saved a life, and now she could return to her world of early morning shifts, community college classes, and dreams that seemed too big for someone like her. But fate, it seems, had other plans. And as the sirens faded into the distance and the manor continued to burn against the midnight sky, the real story was just beginning to unfold. Maya Rodriguez knew what it meant to live on the edge of survival, where every decision carried the weight of her family's future, and every opportunity lost could mean the difference between hope and despair. At 19, she carried responsibilities that would crush most people twice her age, working double shifts as a janitor at Hartford Industries, while maintaining a perfect GPA at community college, all while caring for her ailing mother, whose medical bills grew larger each month like an insurmountable mountain of debt. Her life was a delicate balance of sacrifice and determination, where one missed shift could mean choosing between her mother's medication and the electricity bill, where one failed exam could shatter her dreams of becoming the first person in her family to earn a college degree. The stakes of Maya's existence weren't just financial, though poverty certainly cast its shadow over every aspect of her daily life. She risked her dignity each day enduring the dismissive glances of wealthy executives who saw her only as part of the building's furniture invisible hands that cleaned their offices, while they made decisions worth more money than she would see in a lifetime. She risked her health, working 16-hour days that left her exhausted and running on nothing but determination and instant coffee, knowing that any sign of weakness could cost her the job that kept her family afloat. She risked her future, watching her high school classmates move on to four-year universities while she scraped together enough money for each semester at community college, always one emergency away from having to drop out entirely. But perhaps the greatest risk Maya faced was losing hope itself, that precious flame that burned within her despite the overwhelming odds stacked against her success. In a world where social media constantly reminded her of everything she didn't have, where her wealthy classmates complained about problems that would be luxuries to solve, she risked becoming bitter, cynical, and resigned to a life of limitations. She risked believing the voice in her head that whispered she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to dream beyond her circumstances. Every day she fought against the temptation to give up on her studies, to settle for the security of her janitorial job, rather than pursuing the uncertain path toward something better. The community where Maya lived knew her story well. The girl who worked harder than anyone else but always seemed to be swimming against an impossible current. Her neighbors watched her leave for work before dawn and return after midnight, books tucked under her arm even as exhaustion weighed down her shoulders. They saw her determination, but also understood the precarious nature of her situation. One medical emergency, one job loss, one moment of bad luck could send her tumbling back into the kind of poverty that steals dreams and breaks spirits. Maya lived knowing that she was just one disaster away from losing everything she had worked so hard to build, yet she continued to build anyway, brick by brick, day by day. The night that would change everything began like any other for Maya Rodriguez, with the familiar ritual of preparing for another late shift at Hartford Industries. She packed her worn backpack with textbooks, knowing she would steal moments between cleaning offices to study for her upcoming economics exam, the one that could secure her spot in the business program she desperately needed to transfer to a 4-year university. The Hartford Industries building stood like a monument to success in the city's financial district, its gleaming windows reflecting the dreams of thousands who passed by daily, though few ever made it through its exclusive doors. For Maya, those doors represented both opportunity and barrier. She could enter, but only to clean up after those who truly belonged. That Tuesday evening, the building's usual hum of activity had quieted to the gentle whisper of after-hours cleaning crews and security guards making their rounds. Maya moved through the executive floors with practiced efficiency, her headphones playing recorded lectures as she worked, maximizing every moment in her relentless pursuit of education. She had developed a system over the past 2 years, learning to clean offices while absorbing information about market trends, corporate strategy, and financial analysis. The irony wasn't lost on her. She understood the business discussions she overheard better than many of the executives who held those meetings, yet her insights would never be heard or valued in these marble hallways. The Hartford family's private conference room on the 32nd floor was Maya's final stop each night, a space that overlooked the city like a throne room surveying its kingdom. Tonight, something felt different as she entered the room, though she couldn't quite identify what had changed. The usual family photos lined the credenza, images of Richard Hartford at charity galas, his late wife Catherine at museum openings, and their son Alexander at various stages of his privileged upbringing. Maya had studied these photos countless times over the months, not from any particular interest in the family, but because they represented a world so foreign to her own that they might as well have been exhibits in a museum. As she dusted the mahogany conference table where million-dollar deals were negotiated, Maya allowed herself a moment to imagine what it might feel like to sit in one of those leather chairs, not as a cleaner, but as an equal. She pictured herself presenting business proposals, her ideas valued and respected, her background irrelevant in the face of her competence and vision. These brief flights of imagination were dangerous, she knew, because they made returning to reality more painful. Yet she couldn't stop herself from dreaming. Tonight, however, her reverie was interrupted by the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the building's ventilation system, a scent that made her blood run cold as she realized something was terribly wrong. The fire alarm's piercing wail shattered the building's peaceful silence as Maya rushed to the windows, her heart pounding as she saw flames licking at the base of the Hartford family's private elevator shaft. The building's emergency systems kicked into action, but Maya's training as a volunteer firefighter in her neighborhood told her that something was seriously wrong with the evacuation procedures. Her radio crackled with confused reports from security, and through the chaos she heard something that made her blood freeze. Alexander Hartford was somewhere in the building, trapped by the very fire that was consuming his family's corporate empire floor by floor. Without hesitation, Maya dropped her cleaning supplies and ran toward the emergency stairwell, her heart hammering against her ribs as she descended into the smoky darkness below. Every instinct told her to evacuate, to follow protocol, and leave the rescue to professionals, but something deeper drove her forward. Perhaps it was the memory of her own brother, who had died in a house fire when she was 12, or maybe it was simply the knowledge that every second counted when a life hung in the balance. The smoke grew thicker with each floor she descended, and she used her janitor's master key to check offices and conference rooms, calling Alexander's name until her voice grew hoarse from the effort. She found him on the 28th floor, unconscious in his father's private office, overcome by smoke inhalation as he had apparently tried to save important family documents from the safe. Alexander Hartford, the golden boy she had seen in countless newspaper photos attending gallery openings and charity events, lay crumpled on the Persian rug like any other human being facing mortality. In that moment, Maya saw not the heir to a fortune, but a young man who needed help, and she drew upon reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Lifting his muscular frame across her shoulders, she began the treacherous journey towards safety, each step a monumental effort as the fire spread around them like a living thing, hungry for destruction. The next 20 minutes would later be described by fire investigators as a miracle of timing and courage, though Maya would never see it that way. To her, it was simply what anyone would have done, what anyone should have done when faced with another human being in mortal danger. She navigated through smoke-filled corridors using her intimate knowledge of the building's layout, knowledge gained through hundreds of nights cleaning those same hallways. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her lungs screamed for clean air, and her eyes streamed with tears from the acrid smoke, but she never stopped moving, never considered setting down her burden, even as chunks of ceiling tile crashed around them and emergency lights flickered like dying stars. When Maya finally emerged from the building carrying Alexander in her arms, the scene that greeted them was chaos, orchestrated by flashing emergency lights and urgent voices. Paramedics rushed forward to take Alexander from her trembling arms, while firefighters surrounded her with questions about the building's layout and the location of other potential victims. Through the confusion, she glimpsed Richard Hartford arriving in a black limousine, his composed businessman's facade cracking as he saw his son being loaded into an ambulance. For just a moment, their eyes met across the chaos, and Maya saw something in his expression that went beyond gratitude, a recognition that she had given him back the most precious thing in his world. As paramedics checked Maya for smoke inhalation and minor burns, she watched the Hartford Industries building continue to burn against the night sky, its windows glowing like angry eyes in a face twisted by flame. The structure that had represented everything she aspired to achieve was being destroyed before her eyes, yet she felt no sadness for the loss of marble lobbies and executive suites. What mattered was that a life had been saved, that she had been in the right place at the right time to make a difference. She had no way of knowing that this act of selfless courage would set in motion a series of events that would transform not just her own life, but would reveal truths that would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about her past and her future. The hospital waiting room at 3 a.m. was a fluorescent-lit purgatory where time seemed suspended between hope and fear, and Maya found herself sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing her smoke-stained uniform, and trying to process the surreal events of the evening. She had given her statement to the fire investigators, submitted to a medical examination that confirmed minor smoke inhalation and first-degree burns on her hands, and now she waited with no real reason to stay, except that leaving felt like abandoning something important and unfinished. The nurses had offered to call someone for her, but who would she call? Her mother was sleeping peacefully at home thanks to her evening medication, and Maya saw no point in worrying her with news that would only add stress to their already complicated lives. Richard Hartford sat across the waiting room, and Maya was struck by how different he looked from the confident executive she had seen in business magazines and newspaper photos. Tonight he was simply a father, whose son had nearly died, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with ash, his silver hair disheveled and his hands shaking slightly as he gripped a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and he would nod with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps curiosity about the young woman who had risked her life for his son. Maya wondered what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized her from the building or if she was just another anonymous face in a night full of strangers who had helped save his child. When the doctor finally emerged with news that Alexander was stable and conscious, asking only for oxygen therapy and overnight observation, the relief in Richard Hartford's face was so profound that Maya felt tears welling in her own eyes. She rose to leave, feeling that her vigil was complete and that the Hartford family should have privacy for their reunion, but Richard's voice stopped her at the waiting room door. His words were simple, "Please don't go yet," but they carried a weight that suggested this conversation would be more significant than a simple thank you. Maya returned to her chair, uncertain about what he wanted to say, but sensing that something important was about to happen. "I need to know," Richard Hartford began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, "why you risked your life for someone you don't even know." His question hung in the air between them, and Maya realized that her answer would reveal more about herself than she usually shared with strangers. She thought about her brother Miguel, about her mother's teachings regarding duty to others, about the values that had shaped her despite the harsh circumstances of her upbringing. When she finally spoke, her words came from a place deeper than conscious thought. flowing from the core beliefs that guided her actions even when no one was watching. My mother always told me that we are defined not by what we have but by what we do when others need us, Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hospital's nighttime sounds of beeping monitors and distant conversations. When I heard someone was trapped in that building, I didn't think about who it was or what it might mean for me. I thought about my brother Miguel, who died in a fire when he was 15 because no one was there to help him. I thought about how every life has value regardless of whose name is on the building or whose picture is in the newspapers. I couldn't live with myself if I had walked away knowing someone needed help. Richard Hartford studied her face as she spoke, and Maya could see him processing not just her words, but everything about her. The worn uniform with Rodriguez embroidered on the pocket, the calluses on her hands that spoke of long hours of physical labor, the textbooks visible in her backpack that suggested dreams beyond her current circumstances. She found herself telling him about her work schedule, her studies, her hopes of someday earning a business degree, and perhaps starting a company that could provide jobs for people in her neighborhood. As she talked, she watched his expression change from polite interest to genuine surprise, as if he were discovering that the young woman who had saved his son was far more complex than her janitor's uniform might suggest. "You study business?" Richard asked, leaning forward with renewed attention. "What kind of business interests you?" Maya found herself describing her fascination with social entrepreneurship, her ideas about creating businesses that could be both profitable and beneficial to underserved communities. She talked about her economics classes, her analysis of market gaps in her neighborhood, her vision of companies that could provide good jobs while addressing real social needs. As she spoke, she noticed Richard pulling out his phone to take notes, though she couldn't understand why her amateur thoughts would interest someone who ran a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse announcing that Alexander was asking to meet the person who had saved him, and Maya followed Richard through the hospital corridors, feeling as though she was walking into a different chapter of her life. Alexander Hartford looked younger and more vulnerable lying in the hospital bed, his usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine humility and gratitude. When their eyes met, Maya saw not the privileged air she had expected, but a thoughtful young man who understood the gravity of what had happened and the debt he owed to someone who had acted without any expectation of reward. "I want to do something to repay you," Alexander said, his voice still rough from smoke inhalation. "My father and I have been talking, and we want to help you achieve your dreams. We want to offer you a full scholarship to any university you choose, plus living expenses and support for your mother's medical care." Maya's heart stopped as she processed his words, but even as joy flooded through her, she felt compelled to understand why they would make such a generous offer. "Because," Richard Hartford said, answering her unspoken question, "talent and character like yours shouldn't be wasted cleaning floors when it could be changing the world." Maya returned to her small apartment as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, her mind reeling from the surreal events of the night and the impossible offer that still seemed too good to be true. She moved quietly through the tiny living room where her mother, Rosa Rodriguez, lay sleeping on the couch that doubled as her bed since her arthritis made climbing stairs to the bedroom too painful. Looking at her mother's peaceful face, Maya felt overwhelmed by the possibility that their years of struggle might finally be coming to an end, that the scholarship offer could free them both from the crushing weight of poverty that had shaped every decision of their lives. Sleep proved elusive as Maya lay in her narrow bed, replaying every moment of the rescue and the conversation that had followed, wondering if she had somehow dreamed the entire encounter. The scholarship Richard Hartford had described would cover not just her tuition at any university in the country, but also living expenses, medical care for her mother, and even a stipend for books and supplies. It was the kind of opportunity that people like her simply didn't receive, the kind of life-changing chance that existed only in movies and fairy tales. Yet the sincerity in both father and son's eyes had been unmistakable, as had their determination to ensure she received the education her intelligence and character deserved. When Maya finally dozed, her dreams were filled with images of college campuses and lecture halls, of herself wearing graduation regalia instead of a janitor's uniform, of presenting business plans to investors instead of emptying wastebaskets in executive offices. She dreamed of her mother's face lighting up with pride as Maya walked across a stage to receive her diploma, of the small apartment transformed into a real home, with comfortable furniture and a kitchen table large enough for family dinners. These visions felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant, like mirages that might disappear if she looked too closely or hoped too hard. The sound of her mother moving around the kitchen woke Maya after only a few hours of restless sleep, and she emerged to find Rosa preparing the simple breakfast they shared each morning before beginning their respective days of work and study. Maya struggled with how to explain the night's events without sounding delusional or giving her mother false hope about opportunities that might evaporate in the harsh light of day. How do you tell someone that their life might be about to change completely based on a conversation in a hospital waiting room? How do you share impossible good news when you've both learned that life rarely offers such gifts without extracting an equally significant price? But before Maya could find the right words, the silence was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside their apartment building, an unusual occurrence in a neighborhood where most residents relied on public transportation. Looking out the window, Maya's heart stopped as she recognized the sleek black sedan from the hospital parking lot, and she watched Richard Hartford emerge from the passenger seat, followed by Alexander on crutches, both men surveying the modest neighborhood with expressions of curiosity rather than judgment. They had come to make good on their promise, Maya realized, and she felt her hands trembling as she prepared to open the door to a future she had never dared to imagine. Richard Hartford's presence in Rosa Rodriguez's tiny living room created a surreal tableau that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality, as if two different worlds had suddenly collided and were trying to find equilibrium. He sat carefully on the edge of the worn sofa, his expensive clothes a stark contrast to the second-hand furniture and faded family photos that decorated the modest space. Yet his manner was respectful and warm, rather than condescending. Rosa moved around the small kitchen preparing coffee with the natural grace of someone who had spent a lifetime making guests feel welcome, despite having little to offer her curiosity about their visitors, balanced by the inherent dignity that had carried her through decades of hardship. Alexander remained standing near the window, his crutches propped against the wall as he studied the family photographs that lined Rosa's makeshift mantel. Images of Maya's graduation from high school, her brother Miguel's Little League team, Rosa and her late husband at their wedding 30 years earlier. Maya watched nervously as the Hartford men took in her family's history displayed in cheap frames and faded snapshots, wondering what they saw in these humble chronicles of a working-class family's joys and sorrows. She had cleaned their offices and conference rooms filled with expensive art and professional portraits, and now they were seeing her world reflected in discount store frames and school picture packages. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Richard began carefully, "I want to thank you for raising a daughter who risked her life to save my son. Maya's courage and character reflect the values you instilled in her, and I consider my family forever in your debt." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she processed his words, her pride in Maya evident even as confusion creased her features about why these wealthy strangers were sitting in her living room. Maya translated quickly, explaining the events of the previous night and the scholarship offer that had brought the Hartfords to their door, watching her mother's expression transform from bewilderment to disbelief to cautious hope. But as Richard Hartford continued talking, something in his tone shifted, becoming more personal and intense, as if the formal gratitude was giving way to something deeper and more complex. "There's something else I need to discuss with both of you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a manila envelope thick with documents. "Something that Maya's heroism last night has prompted me to finally address, after keeping it hidden for far too long." The envelope seemed to carry weight beyond its physical dimensions, and Maya felt a chill of premonition as Richard's hands trembled slightly while holding it. 19 years ago, Richard continued, his voice growing thick with emotion, my wife Catherine had an affair with a young man named Carlos Rodriguez, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at one of our properties. The affair lasted only a few months, but it resulted in a pregnancy that Catherine kept secret from everyone, including me. Maya felt the world tilting around her as she processed his words, her mind racing to understand the implications while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The silence that followed Richard Hartford's revelation was so complete that Maya could hear the ticking of the old clock on Rosa's kitchen wall, each second marking time in a reality that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Rosa's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake, her face draining of color as she stared at Richard, with an expression that mixed shock, denial, and growing understanding. Maya felt as though she was watching the scene from outside her own body, observing this impossible moment where the foundations of her entire existence were being rewritten by a stranger in an expensive suit who claimed to hold the key to her true identity. Catherine gave birth to you in a private clinic in Mexico. Richard continued, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. She told me she was visiting her sister for an extended vacation, but she was actually hiding the pregnancy from everyone who knew her. After you were born, she made arrangements for Carlos and Rosa to adopt you, believing that you would have a better life growing up in a loving family, rather than as the illegitimate daughter of a woman who couldn't acknowledge your existence without destroying her marriage and social position. Maya's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications of Richard's words, while Rosa remained frozen in her chair, neither confirming nor denying the story that was unfolding like a surreal drama in their tiny living room. The family photos that had always told the story of Maya's life suddenly looked different, as if she were seeing them through new eyes that could detect the subtle inconsistencies she had never noticed before. She had always wondered why she looked so different from her parents, why her academic abilities seemed to come from nowhere in a family where education had never been emphasized, why she felt driven by ambitions that seemed foreign to everyone around her. Rosa, Richard said gently, turning to address Maya's adoptive mother directly. Catherine paid you, and Carlos $50,000 to raise Maya as your own, with the understanding that her true parentage would never be revealed. You honored that agreement perfectly, giving Maya the love and stability that Catherine wanted for her daughter, but couldn't provide herself. But Catherine also established a trust fund for Maya's education, one that I've been managing secretly for the past 19 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth and ensure that Maya could claim her rightful inheritance. The truth hit Maya like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak as she sank into the nearest chair. Everything she had believed about herself, her family, and her place in the world was being rewritten in real time, and she struggled to understand how the woman who had raised her with such love and sacrifice could have kept such a monumental secret. Rosa finally found her voice speaking in Spanish through her tears, explaining that she and Carlos had never intended to deceive Maya, but had promised Catherine that they would protect the secret until Maya was old enough to handle the truth and choose her own path forward. Alexander, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, suddenly stepped forward and knelt beside Maya's chair, taking her hands in his as the full realization hit them both simultaneously. That makes you my half-sister, he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. All these years, while you were cleaning our building and studying in those conference rooms, you were family. You belong there not because you work there, but because it's your birthright. Maya looked into Alexander's eyes and saw her own shock reflected back at her, mixed with something else. Relief, perhaps, or recognition, as if some part of him had always sensed a connection he couldn't explain. The hours that followed Richard Hartford's revelation passed in a dreamlike haze as Maya struggled to reconcile the woman who had raised her with the woman who had kept such a profound secret, and the family she had thought she knew with the family she was now discovering herself to be. Rosa, through tears and trembling hands, produced a wooden box from beneath her bed that contained letters Catherine Hartford had written to Maya throughout her childhood. Letters that had never been delivered but had been carefully preserved as a testament to a mother's love that couldn't be openly expressed. Reading Catherine's words, Maya found herself connecting with a woman she had never known, but whose thoughts and dreams eerily echoed her own. Catherine wrote about her hopes for Maya's education, her pride in the intelligence and determination she was certain her daughter would display, and her regret about the circumstances that prevented her from being part of Maya's daily life. The letters painted a picture of a woman trapped between duty and desire, between social expectations and maternal instinct, who had made the painful decision to give up her daughter in order to give her a better life than scandal and shame could provide. She died when you were 12. Richard explained, his voice thick with emotion as he watched Maya read the letters that bridged the gap between mother and daughter. Cancer took her quickly, but she spent her final months making sure everything was in place for your future. The trust fund she established has grown to over $2 million, enough to pay for your education at any university in the world, and to provide security for both you and Rosa for the rest of your lives. She made me promise to tell you the truth when you turned 21. But your actions last night convinced me that you're already mature enough to handle this responsibility. Maya found herself caught between gratitude for the opportunities this revelation would provide and anger at the deception that had shaped her entire life. Wondering how different her childhood might have been if she had known about her true heritage and the resources that were always meant to be hers, Rosa reached for her hands, speaking in the mixture of Spanish and English that had always marked their most emotional conversations, explaining that she had feared losing Maya if the truth ever came out, that she had loved her as fiercely as any biological mother could love a child, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Alexander, meanwhile, was processing his own complicated emotions about discovering that the young woman he had always dismissed as part of the building's maintenance staff was actually his half-sister, someone who shared his blood and his inheritance even if she hadn't shared his privileges. He talked about the loneliness of his privileged upbringing, the pressure of being the sole heir to the Hartford legacy, and the relief he felt at discovering that he wasn't alone in carrying the weight of family expectations. I always felt like something was missing, he admitted, like there was a piece of our family that I couldn't identify but knew was absent. Now I understand what that was. As the reality of her new circumstances began to settle in Maya's mind, she found herself thinking not about the wealth or opportunities that were now within reach, but about the responsibility that came with them, and the question of how she wanted to use these resources to honor both the woman who had given birth to her and the woman who had raised her with such love and sacrifice. The transformation of Maya's life from poverty to privilege happened with a swiftness that left her feeling dizzy and unmoored, as if she had been picked up by a tornado and set down in a completely different landscape where all the familiar landmarks had disappeared. Within a week of Richard Hartford's revelation, she found herself living in a guest suite at the Hartford family estate, a space larger than the entire apartment she had shared with Rosa, surrounded by luxury that felt simultaneously wonderful and overwhelming. The marble bathrooms, the walk-in closets filled with designer clothes purchased by personal shoppers, and the view of manicured gardens stretching to the horizon seemed like props in an elaborate play where she was still learning her role. Alexander had taken on the task of introducing Maya to her new world with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had a sister to share his experiences with. But each lesson in privilege came with its own set of complications and ethical dilemmas. Learning to navigate country club dining rooms where the silverware alone cost more than Maya used to earn in a month, attending charity galas where wealthy donors wrote checks equivalent to her mother's annual income, while complaining about tax policies and sitting through family board meetings where decisions affecting thousands of employees were made based on profit margins rather than human impact. All of these experiences forced Maya to confront the vast gulf between the world she had been born into and the world where she had been raised. The most challenging aspect of Maya's new circumstances wasn't the material wealth or social expectations, but rather the growing realization that her perspective as someone who had lived in poverty gave her insights into the Hartford business empire that no one else in her newfound family seemed to possess. She found herself questioning investment strategies that displaced low-income families, marketing campaigns that exploited economic insecurity, and employment practices that kept wages artificially low while executives received bonuses worth millions. Her suggestions for more ethical business practices were met with polite interest but little action, as if her experiences were interesting curiosities rather than valuable insights into how the company's policies affected real people's lives. Rosa had moved into a comfortable apartment near the Hartford estate, her medical bills now covered by the family's insurance and her future secured by Catherine's trust fund, but the adjustment to their new circumstances was proving difficult for both mother and daughter. Rosa worried that the wealth and privilege would change Maya's character, that the girl who had risked her life to save a stranger might lose her compassion and humility amid the comfort and luxury of her new position. Maya, for her part, struggled with guilt about enjoying privileges that were denied to her former classmates and neighbors, wondering if accepting her inheritance made her complicit in the same system of inequality that had kept her family trapped in poverty for so many years. The media attention surrounding Maya's story, janitor's daughter discovers she's billionaire's child, brought additional complications as journalists and social media commentators debated whether she deserved her inheritance or was simply the beneficiary of an accident of birth. Some praised her courage in saving Alexander and saw her rise to wealth as a heartwarming example of good deeds being rewarded, while others criticized the Hartford family for keeping her in poverty while they knew she was entitled to a share of their fortune. Maya found herself thrust into a public spotlight she had never sought, forced to defend both her character and her claim to a legacy that still felt foreign and unearned, despite the legal documents that proved her parentage. As Maya settled into her new life, she discovered that straddling two vastly different worlds, the poverty she had left behind and the wealth she had inherited, created a unique form of emotional vertigo that left her constantly questioning her identity and her place in both communities. Her former classmates at community college looked at her differently now, some with admiration for her good fortune, but others with suspicion that success had changed her fundamental character. She tried to maintain her friendships and continue her studies, but conversations felt strained as her old friends struggled to relate to someone whose biggest concerns had shifted from paying rent to deciding which charity deserved a substantial donation. The wealthy social circles she was now expected to navigate presented their own challenges. As Maya found herself surrounded by people who had never experienced real hardship and seemed unable to comprehend the realities of life without financial security. At dinner parties and social events, she listened to complaints about staff shortages at vacation homes and delays in luxury car deliveries, while mentally calculating how the money spent on a single evening as entertainment could fund scholarships for dozens of students from backgrounds like her own. The disconnect between her new peers' concerns and the problems she had grown up witnessing created a sense of isolation that wealth couldn't alleviate. Alexander proved to be her most valuable ally in navigating this complex transition, as he worked to help Maya find her footing in a world that was simultaneously her birthright and completely foreign to her lived experience. He shared stories about the loneliness of growing up wealthy, the pressure of living up to family expectations, and the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when people's motives were always suspect due to his inheritance. Their growing sibling bond was built on mutual understanding. He envied her authentic connections and real-world experience, while she appreciated his guidance through the labyrinthine social expectations of their shared class position. Maya's biggest struggle during this period was determining how to use her newfound resources in a way that honored both her humble beginnings and her current privileges, seeking a path that would allow her to create positive change without abandoning the values that had shaped her character during her years of hardship. She began developing plans for a foundation that would provide educational opportunities for low-income students, using her unique perspective to design programs that addressed the real barriers to success that she had experienced firsthand. But translating her vision into action required navigating complex legal structures, family politics, and social expectations that sometimes seemed designed to prevent the kind of meaningful change she wanted to create. The pressure of living up to both her public image as the heroic janitor turned heiress and her private desire to remain true to her authentic self created stress that manifested in sleepless nights and moments of paralyzing doubt about her ability to fulfill the responsibilities that came with her new position. Maya found herself questioning whether she was strong enough to bridge the gap between privilege and poverty, whether she could maintain her compassion and humility while wielding the kind of power and influence that her inheritance represented. These doubts were complicated by the realization that her story had become larger than her personal journey, inspiring countless others who saw in her transformation proof that their own circumstances were not permanent barriers to success. 6 months after the fire that changed everything, Maya faced her first major test of character when Hartford Industries proposed a massive development project that would bring jobs and revenue to the city, but would also require the demolition of the low-income neighborhood where she had grown up. The project promised to revitalize an economically depressed area with mixed-use development that included retail spaces, office buildings, and upscale housing. But the plans made no provision for the current residents, who would be displaced by construction and priced out by the resulting gentrification. As a member of the Hartford family and a newly appointed advisor to the company's community development division, Maya found herself in the impossible position of choosing between her family's business interests and her loyalty to the community that had shaped her. The neighborhood association meetings she attended were heartbreaking reminders of the life she had left behind, as she listened to elderly residents worry about finding affordable housing in an increasingly expensive city, and young families express fear about being separated from the schools, churches, and support networks that had sustained them through years of struggle. Maya saw herself in the faces of the children who would be forced to leave the only home they had ever known, and she heard echoes of her own mother's voice in the concerns of parents who were working multiple jobs, but still couldn't afford to live anywhere else in the city. Richard Hartford and the company's board of directors viewed the development project through the lens of economic opportunity and urban renewal, focusing on job creation statistics and tax revenue projections, while dismissing concerns about displacement as unfortunate but necessary casualties of progress. They pointed to plans for workforce housing that would technically be affordable, but would still cost more than most current residents could afford, and they emphasized the long-term benefits of bringing investment and infrastructure improvements to an area that had been neglected by previous development efforts. From their perspective, the project represented responsible capitalism that would benefit the greater good, even if it required some short-term sacrifice from current residents. Maya found herself caught between two versions of the truth, both of which contained valid elements but led to fundamentally different conclusions about what constituted ethical business practice. The Hartford perspective emphasized economic growth, job creation, and urban renewal as forces for positive change that would ultimately benefit everyone, even if the transition period was difficult for some residents. The community perspective focused on the human cost of displacement, the destruction of social networks and cultural institutions, and the pattern of wealthy developers profiting from the removal of poor residents whose presence was seen as an obstacle to prosperity rather than a community asset worth preserving. The tension reached a breaking point during a heated board meeting, where Maya presented an alternative development plan that would preserve affordable housing, relocate displaced families within the same neighborhood, and include current residents as stakeholders in the new development rather than obstacles to be removed. Her proposal would reduce the project's profit margins, but would demonstrate that Hartford Industries could be a force for inclusive economic development rather than yet another example of corporate greed disguising itself as urban renewal. The silence that followed her presentation was deafening, and Maya could see in her family's faces the exact moment when they realized that her transformation from janitor to heiress had not eliminated her loyalty to the working class that had raised her. The weeks following Maya's alternative proposal were filled with tense family meetings, heated arguments with board members, and sleepless nights as she wrestled with the realization that her vision for ethical business practices might be incompatible with her family's profit-driven approach to development. Alexander stood by her side, using his position as the company's heir apparent to support her plans and advocate for a more socially responsible approach to the neighborhood project. Richard Hartford, however, remained skeptical about Maya's proposal, viewing it as naive idealism that ignored the economic realities of large-scale development and the fiduciary responsibilities the company owed to its shareholders. The situation came to a head when community activists, inspired by Maya's public support for their cause, organized protests outside Hartford Industries headquarters, demanding that the company abandon its displacement-based development plan in favor of Maya's community-inclusive alternative. Media coverage of the protests focused heavily on the irony of Maya Hartford, the former janitor-turned-heiress, advocating against her own family's business interests in support of the community where she had grown up. The story became a national sensation, with Maya portrayed as either a heroic advocate for social justice or a naive young woman being manipulated by activist groups, depending on the political orientation of the news outlet reporting the story. Maya's relationship with Richard Hartford reached its lowest point during a confrontational board meeting, where he accused her of biting the hand that fed her and forgetting that her newfound wealth came from the same business practices she was now criticizing. You can't have it both ways, he told her in front of the assembled board members. Either you're part of this family and this business, with all the responsibilities that entails, or you're an outside agitator who happens to share our DNA. But you can't claim your inheritance while simultaneously trying to destroy the source of that wealth. His words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Maya was indeed trying to have it both ways to enjoy the benefits of her privileged position while using that position to challenge the system that had created those benefits. The moment of truth arrived when the board called for a formal vote on the development proposal, with Maya's alternative plan competing directly against the original displacement-based project that promised higher returns but greater social costs. As the newest and youngest member of the board, Maya's vote would be largely symbolic, since the other members had already made their positions clear. But she understood that this moment would define not just her role in the company, but her identity as a person. Would she choose the financial security and family acceptance that came with supporting the profitable but harmful development? Or would she risk her relationships and her position by standing with the community that had raised her? When the vote was called, Maya stood before the assembled board members, men and women in expensive suits who controlled billions of dollars and thousands of jobs, and thought about Rosa, who had raised her to believe that character was more important than comfort, and about Catherine, who had sacrificed her relationship with her daughter in order to give her a better life. She thought about the children in her old neighborhood, who deserved the same opportunities she had received, and about the responsibility that came with having both the power to create change and the moral obligation to use that power wisely. When she cast her vote in favor of the Community Inclusive Development Plan, she knew she was choosing to honor the values that had shaped her character, rather than the expectations that came with her new class position. Maya's vote against the family's preferred development plan created a schism within the Hartford family that took months to heal, as Richard struggled to understand how the daughter he had gained could seemingly turn against the family legacy so quickly after discovering her place within it. The board ultimately approved a modified version of Maya's proposal, after Alexander used his influence to build support among younger board members, who were increasingly concerned about the company's public image and long-term sustainability. The compromise plan preserved most of the affordable housing in the target neighborhood, while still moving forward with development that would create jobs and generate revenue, though at lower profit margins than the original proposal would have provided. The media coverage of Maya's principled stand transformed her from a curiosity, the janitor who became an heiress, into a symbol of socially conscious wealth and ethical business leadership. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, nonprofit organizations, and business conferences where her story of using privilege to lift others was held up as an example of how inherited wealth could be a force for positive social change. Maya initially struggled with her new role as a public speaker and thought leader, feeling unqualified to offer advice about leadership and social responsibility when she was still learning to navigate her own complex circumstances. Rosa watched her daughter's evolution with a mixture of pride and concern, proud of Maya's unwillingness to abandon her values even when doing so would have been easier and more profitable, but worried that the constant pressure of public attention and family conflict was taking a toll on Maya's emotional well-being. She reminded Maya that strength wasn't measured by the absence of doubt or fear, but by the willingness to act according to one's principles even when the outcome was uncertain. "You saved Alexander from a burning building," Rosa told her daughter during one of their weekly lunches. "But saving your community from displacement while staying true to your family requires a different kind of courage, the courage to disappoint people you love in order to protect people you care about." Alexander's support proved crucial during this difficult period, as he used his position within the company to advocate for Maya's vision while helping to bridge the gap between her idealistic goals and the practical constraints of running a large corporation. Their sibling relationship deepened as they worked together to implement the community development project, with Alexander handling the financial and logistical details, while Maya focused on community engagement and ensuring that current residents had a meaningful voice in decisions that affected their lives. Together, they began to envision a different kind of Hartford Industries, one that could be profitable while also being socially responsible, successful while also being ethical. The success of the Modified Development Project, which created jobs for neighborhood residents while preserving the community's character and affordability, demonstrated that Maya's vision of ethical business practices was not just idealistic dreaming, but a viable approach to corporate leadership that could benefit both shareholders and communities. Other Hartford Industries projects began incorporating similar community engagement strategies, and Maya found herself appointed to head a new division focused on socially responsible development. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both poverty and wealth enabled her to identify opportunities for profitable projects that also addressed real social needs, creating a business model that other companies began to emulate. 2 years after the fire that changed everything, Maya stood before the graduating class of the Rodriguez Hartford Community College, an institution she had founded using her trust fund inheritance to provide free higher education to students from low-income backgrounds. The campus, built in the heart of the neighborhood where she had grown up, served as a symbol of what was possible when privilege was used not to separate oneself from one's origins, but to lift one's entire community toward greater opportunities. The college's mission statement, written by Maya herself, declared that education should be a right rather than a privilege, and that talent and character were more important qualifications for success than family wealth or social connections. The first graduating class included many of Maya's former classmates from her community college days, students who had been able to complete their 4-year degrees without accumulating crushing debt thanks to the full scholarships provided by the Rodriguez Hartford Foundation. Maya had insisted on including her adoptive mother's surname in both the college and foundation names, honoring the woman who had raised her with love and sacrifice, while also acknowledging the biological heritage that had made her educational philanthropy possible. The naming choice reflected Maya's determination to bridge rather than abandon her two identities, integrating her working-class roots with her inherited wealth rather than allowing one to overshadow the other. Alexander, now serving as CEO of Hartford Industries following his father's gradual retirement, had transformed the company, his mission to align with Maya's vision of ethical capitalism that prioritized both profit and social impact. Under his leadership, and with Maya's guidance as head of community development, Hartford Industries had become a model for socially responsible business practices, demonstrating that companies could generate significant returns for shareholders while also creating positive outcomes for employees, communities, and the environment. Their approach had attracted talented young executives who were drawn to the company's commitment to using business as a force for social good, rather than simply as a wealth generation machine. Richard Hartford, initially resistant to his children's reforms, had gradually come to appreciate the wisdom of their approach as he watched the company's reputation improve, employee satisfaction increase, and long-term profitability stabilize even as short-term profit margins decreased slightly. He had begun attending community events and foundation fundraisers, where he met the people whose lives had been improved by Maya's initiatives, and these personal encounters had helped him understand that social responsibility was not just good public relations, but good business strategy that created loyal customers, dedicated employees, and sustainable growth. His relationship with Maya had healed as he recognized that her challenges to the family business came not from ingratitude or rebellion, but from a deep commitment to using their resources to create the kind of world where children like she had been wouldn't have to choose between their education and their family's survival. Maya's personal journey had evolved from the desperate struggle of trying to balance multiple jobs and school while caring for an ill parent, to the overwhelming adjustment of sudden wealth and privilege, to the current phase of purposeful leadership where she could use her unique experiences to create opportunities for others. She had learned to navigate the complex intersection of privilege and responsibility, finding ways to enjoy the security and opportunities that came with her inheritance, while never forgetting the lessons about resilience, compassion, and hard work that had been forged during her years of hardship. The young woman who had once cleaned offices now sat in board meetings as an equal, but she approached her leadership role with the humility and authenticity that had been shaped by her experiences on the other side of the economic divide. Maya's story had inspired a movement among young inheritors of family wealth who were seeking ways to use their privileged positions to address systemic inequality rather than simply perpetuating it. The Rodriguez Hartford Foundation had partnered with similar organizations across the country to create a network of educational and entrepreneurial opportunities, specifically designed for students from low-income backgrounds, providing not just financial support, but also mentorship, career guidance, and business development resources. Maya had become a sought-after speaker at conferences focused on social entrepreneurship and impact investing, where her journey from poverty to purpose resonated with audiences who were looking for examples of how wealth could be used responsibly. The community where Maya had grown up had been transformed not through displacement and gentrification, but through investment and empowerment that had preserved its character while expanding its opportunities. The neighborhood now boasted the community college campus, a business incubator focused on supporting minority and women entrepreneurs, and a network of affordable housing that had been developed in partnership with current residents rather than in spite of their presence. Local businesses had flourished as increased investment brought customers and opportunities to the area, while longtime residents had been able to benefit from the economic development rather than being forced out by it. Rosa Rodriguez had become something of a local celebrity, as the mother who had raised a daughter capable of such extraordinary generosity and leadership, but she remained grounded in the simple values of family, community, and service that had always guided her life. She continued to live modestly, despite having access to significant wealth, using her resources primarily to support other families facing medical emergencies or educational challenges similar to those she and Maya had experienced. Her relationship with Maya had deepened as they worked together on foundation projects, with Rosa providing wisdom and perspective that helped Maya stay connected to her roots while pursuing her ambitious goals for social change. Alexander had found his own sense of purpose through his partnership with Maya, discovering that his business school education and executive training were most fulfilling when applied to projects that created value for society, as well as shareholders. He had used his inheritance to launch several startup companies focused on developing affordable technology solutions for underserved communities, applying the same innovative thinking that had made Hartford Industries successful to problems like access to healthcare, education, and financial services. His relationship with Maya had evolved from the awkward discovery of their sibling connection into a genuine partnership built on shared values and complementary skills. The Hartford Industries example had influenced other family-owned businesses to examine their own practices and consider how they could better balance profit with purpose, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond Maya's individual story. Business schools had begun incorporating case studies of the company's transformation into their curricula, using Maya's approach as an example of how next-generation leaders could honor their family legacies while adapting to changing social expectations about corporate responsibility. The story had become a template for how inherited wealth could be stewarded in ways that created opportunity rather than perpetuating inequality. 5 years after that life-changing night, Maya often reflected on the series of seemingly random events that had led to her transformation. The fire alarm that had malfunctioned and delayed the evacuation, the maintenance schedule that had placed her in the building at exactly the right moment, the courage that had overcome her fear when she heard that someone needed help. She had come to understand that her story wasn't really about luck or coincidence, but about the way character reveals itself in moments of crisis and how being prepared to act on your values can open doors that seemed permanently closed. The young woman who had once felt invisible in the hallways of power had learned to use her voice effectively in boardrooms and public forums, but she had also learned the importance of listening to community members whose experiences differed from her own, to colleagues who challenged her assumptions, and to family members who were learning to see the world through her eyes. Maya had discovered that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions and creating spaces where solutions could emerge from collective wisdom rather than individual brilliance. Her relationship with wealth had evolved from the desperate scarcity of her childhood through the overwhelming abundance of her inheritance to a more mature understanding of resources as tools that could be used either to build walls or bridges between different communities and experiences. Maya had learned to live comfortably but not extravagantly, to enjoy the security and opportunities that came with financial stability, while never forgetting the anxiety and limitation that characterized life without economic safety nets. She had found ways to use her privilege that felt authentic to her values, rather than performative for public approval. The integration of her two identities, Maya Rodriguez, the janitor's daughter, and Maya Hartford, the billionaire heiress, had required years of internal work to resolve the tension between gratitude for her opportunities and anger about the systemic inequalities that had made her transformation seem miraculous, rather than simply the natural result of talent meeting opportunity. She had learned to hold both truths simultaneously: appreciation for the family that had claimed her and the family that had raised her, pride in her achievements and awareness of the advantages that had made those achievements possible, hope for continued progress, and realistic assessment of how much work remained to be done. Maya's romantic relationships had been complicated by her unique position as someone whose personal story had become public property, and whose wealth made it difficult to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated interest. She had learned to value partners who had known her before her transformation, or who had achieved their own success independently, people who could see beyond the fairy tale narrative to the complex reality of a person still figuring out how to use unprecedented opportunities responsibly. Her eventual marriage to David Chen, a social worker she had met through her foundation's mentorship programs, was built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than convenience or calculation. Maya's story had become more than personal triumph. It had evolved into a symbol of possibility that resonated with millions of people who saw in her journey proof that circumstances could change, that effort and character mattered more than initial advantages, and that success could be defined by contribution to others rather than accumulation for oneself. The hundreds of letters she received each week from young people facing similar challenges to those she had experienced reminded her of the responsibility that came with being a public example of transformation, and the importance of using her platform to amplify other voices rather than simply celebrating her own achievements. The Rodriguez Hartford Community College had become a model that was replicated in cities across the country, demonstrating that targeted investment in education could break cycles of poverty while strengthening communities rather than displacing them. The college's graduates had gone on to launch businesses, enter graduate schools, and take leadership roles in their communities, creating a multiplier effect where Maya's initial investment in education continued to generate returns in the form of increased opportunity and social mobility for hundreds of families. Hartford Industries had become a case study in corporate transformation, showing how traditional businesses could adapt to changing social expectations without sacrificing profitability or competitiveness. Other companies had recruited executives trained in the Hartford model, spreading the approach to socially responsible business practices across multiple industries and geographic regions. The company's success had challenged assumptions about the incompatibility of profit and purpose, demonstrating that ethical business practices could be sources of competitive advantage rather than obstacles to success. Maya's advocacy for policy changes that would make her story less exceptional: universal access to healthcare, affordable higher education, and living wages for essential workers, had contributed to broader conversations about economic inequality and social mobility in America. She had testified before Congress about the importance of educational funding, spoken at the United Nations about sustainable development, and partnered with international organizations to replicate her community development model in other countries. Her voice had become influential, not because of her wealth, but because of her unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both sides of the economic divide. The foundation Maya had established had evolved into one of the country's largest providers of educational scholarships and entrepreneurial support for low-income students. But its impact was measured not just in dollars distributed, but in lives transformed and communities strengthened. The foundation's approach emphasized mentorship and long-term support, rather than simply providing money, recognizing that success required not just financial resources, but also social capital, professional networks, and ongoing guidance from people who understood both the challenges and opportunities that came with crossing class boundaries. 10 years after the fire that changed everything, Maya faced her greatest challenge yet, when the economic recession threatened to destroy everything she had built, forcing her to choose between preserving her personal wealth and maintaining her commitment to the communities that depended on her foundation's support. The stock market crash had devastated the investments that funded the Rodriguez Hartford Foundation's operations. while simultaneously increasing demand for the foundation's services as unemployment rose and families struggled with foreclosures and medical bankruptcies. Maya could have protected her personal assets by scaling back the foundation's commitments, but doing so would have betrayed the values that had guided her transformation from poverty to purpose. The Board of Trustees, led by financial advisors who prioritized preservation of capital over social impact, recommended suspending scholarship programs and closing community centers until the economic crisis passed and the foundation's investments recovered their value. Maya found herself in the familiar position of standing alone against supposedly practical advice that prioritized financial security over human needs. But this time the stakes were even higher, because failure wouldn't just affect her personally, but would abandon thousands of students and families who had built their hopes around the opportunities the foundation provided. Alexander, whose own business was struggling with the economic downturn, initially supported the board's conservative approach, arguing that the foundation couldn't help anyone if it went bankrupt, trying to maintain unsustainable funding levels during the crisis. Their disagreement created the most serious rift in their sibling relationship, since the early days after Maya's discovery of her heritage as Alexander accused her of allowing her emotions to override sound business judgment, while Maya accused him of forgetting the values that had inspired their transformation of Hartford Industries in the first place. The crisis deepened when several major donors withdrew their support from the foundation, concerned about their own financial stability and skeptical about Maya's refusal to reduce commitments to match reduced resources. Media coverage of the foundation's struggles portrayed Maya as either a heroic figure, fighting to maintain her principles during difficult times, or a naive idealist whose inexperience with wealth was leading to financial irresponsibility that would ultimately harm the people she claimed to want to help. The pressure was overwhelming, and Maya found herself questioning whether her critics were right about her inability to balance idealism with pragmatism. The moment of truth came during an emergency board meeting, where Maya was presented with an ultimatum: accept the recommended cuts to programs and services, or face a vote of no confidence that would remove her from leadership of the organization she had founded. As she sat in the conference room where this journey had begun, the same Hartford Industries building where she had once cleaned floors and dreamed of impossible futures, Maya understood that this decision would define not just the foundation's future, but the meaning of everything she had experienced since that night she rescued Alexander from the flames. Maya's response to the foundation's crisis revealed the depth of character that had been forged through her journey from poverty to privilege and back to purpose. Rather than choosing between fiscal responsibility and social commitment, she found a third path that honored both concerns while staying true to her core values. Maya announced that she would liquidate her personal assets, selling properties, artwork, and investments to create an emergency fund that would allow the foundation to maintain its full level of services during the economic crisis, while also establishing a more sustainable funding model for the future. The decision to risk her personal financial security to protect the foundation's mission shocked both supporters and critics, as Maya demonstrated a level of commitment that went far beyond typical philanthropic gestures. She sold the Hartford family estate that had been her refuge during the early days of adjustment to wealth, downsized her living situation to a modest apartment near the community college campus, and embraced a lifestyle that was comfortable but not luxurious. The actions sent a powerful message that her values were not abstract principles, but lived commitments that she was willing to sacrifice for when circumstances demanded it. Alexander, witnessing his sister's willingness to give up her security to protect her mission, experienced his own moment of transformation as he realized that Maya's approach to wealth represented not naive idealism, but sophisticated understanding of how resources could be used to create lasting change. He joined Maya in liquidating assets to support the foundation, and together they developed a new business model that made the organization less dependent on investment returns and more connected to community fundraising, and earned revenue from social enterprises that the foundation had helped to launch. The foundation not only survived the economic crisis, but emerged stronger and more resilient than before, having proven that its commitment to social justice was more than rhetoric, and that its leadership was willing to make personal sacrifices to honor promises made to communities in need. The story of Maya's response to the crisis became legendary in philanthropic circles, establishing a new standard for authentic commitment to social change and inspiring other wealthy individuals to examine their own relationship with their resources and responsibilities. Rosa Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still sharp and engaged, watched her daughter navigate this crisis with the pride of a mother who had raised a child capable of extraordinary moral courage. She reminded Maya that the true measure of wealth wasn't what you accumulated, but what you were willing to give up for others, and that the girl who had risked her life to save Alexander from a fire was the same woman who was now risking her fortune to save her community from abandonment during hard times. The personal cost of Maya's decision was significant. She would never again enjoy the financial security that her inheritance had initially provided, and she would have to work for the rest of her life rather than living off investment returns. But the decision also freed her from the burden of managing vast personal wealth and allowed her to focus entirely on the Foundation's mission without the distraction of protecting her own privileged position. Maya had chosen purpose over security, and in doing so had discovered a form of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or diminished by market crashes. 15 years after that pivotal night, Maya Rodriguez Hartford stood before the United Nations General Assembly as the recipient of the Global Humanitarian Award, representing not just her own achievements, but the power of individual transformation to create ripples of positive change that could span continents and generations. Her speech to the assembled delegates focused not on her personal journey from poverty to purpose, but on the structural changes needed to ensure that her story would become less exceptional and more representative of the opportunities available to all young people, regardless of their economic circumstances. The Rodriguez Hartford Foundation had evolved into an international organization, operating in 12 countries, providing education, entrepreneurship support, and community development resources to underserved populations, while maintaining its core commitment to empowering people, rather than creating dependency. Maya had learned to delegate operational responsibilities to a talented team of executives, while she focused on strategic vision, policy advocacy, and the kind of inspirational leadership that could mobilize resources and attention around critical social issues. Alexander had become a leading voice in the movement for corporate social responsibility, serving on boards and advisory committees that helped other family businesses navigate the balance between profit and purpose that he and Maya had learned to achieve at Hartford Industries. His marriage to Dr. Sarah Kim, a physician who ran free clinics in underserved communities, reflected his commitment to using his privileges for social good while building a family life grounded in service rather than self-indulgence. The community where Maya had grown up had become a model of sustainable development that preserved affordability and cultural identity while creating economic opportunities and improving quality of life for residents. The neighborhood was frequently visited by urban planners, policymakers, and community organizers who wanted to understand how gentrification could be prevented while still investing in infrastructure, education, and business development. Maya's approach had demonstrated that the choice between helping communities and displacing them was a false dilemma that could be resolved through genuine partnership and long-term commitment. Rosa Rodriguez had lived to see her daughter's work recognized on the global stage, and her final years had been spent as the Foundation's elder stateswoman, sharing wisdom gained through decades of struggle and sacrifice with young people who were beginning their own journeys toward making a difference in the world. Her funeral had been attended by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by Maya's work, but who understood that the values driving that work had been planted by a woman who raised her daughter to believe that character mattered more than circumstances. Maya's personal life had found stability and joy in her marriage to David and their 3 children, who were growing up with an understanding of both privilege and responsibility, that their mother hoped would prepare them to continue the work of using resources to create opportunity rather than perpetuating inequality. The family lived modestly by choice, traveled frequently for Maya's work, and spent summers volunteering with foundation projects so that the children could understand firsthand the impact of their family's mission. As Maya prepared to step back from day-to-day leadership of the foundation to focus on writing and teaching, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a split-second decision to run toward danger rather than away from it to help someone who needed assistance regardless of the personal risk involved. That moment of instinctive courage had revealed a character that had been shaped by years of hardship, but had never been hardened by bitterness or resentment, and it had opened doors to opportunities that she had used not for personal aggrandizement, but for collective empowerment. The woman who had once cleaned offices in buildings owned by her biological father had learned that true inheritance wasn't money or property, but values and vision that could be passed down through generations of people committed to creating a more just and equitable world. Maya's real legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars donated or programs funded, but in the young people who had been inspired by her example to use their own talents and resources, however modest, to lift others toward greater possibilities. The story that had begun with a fire in a mansion had become a testament to the transformative power of education, the importance of authentic leadership, and the possibility of using privilege as a bridge rather than a barrier between different communities and experiences. Maya had proven that circumstances could change, that character was more important than birthright, and that the most profound revolutions often began with individual decisions to act on values rather than self-interest when faced with moments of moral choice. The foundation that bore her name would continue its work long after Maya was gone, but its impact was already visible in the thousands of young people who had received educations they couldn't have afforded, the communities that had been strengthened rather than displaced by development, and the businesses that had learned to measure success by social impact as well as financial returns. Each scholarship recipient, each successful entrepreneur, each policy change that expanded opportunity represented a continuation of the story that had begun when a young woman chose courage over comfort in the face of danger. Maya's journey from the invisible janitor to the globally recognized humanitarian had required not just the accident of noble birth, but the consistent choice to use opportunities for others' benefit rather than personal advantage. She had learned that true wealth came not from what you accumulated, but from what you contributed, not from what you achieved, but from what you enabled others to accomplish, not from the recognition you received, but from the hope you inspired in people who were still writing their own stories of transformation. The night of the Hartford Manor fire had seemed like an ending. The destruction of a grand estate, the near death of a young man, the desperate heroism of a working-class girl. But it had actually been a beginning, the first chapter of a story about how individual acts of courage and compassion could ripple outward to create waves of change that reached far beyond anything the original actor could have imagined. Maya's life had become proof that every person carried within themselves the potential for extraordinary impact if they could find the courage to act on their highest values when the moment demanded it. As Maya looked toward the future, she saw not the completion of her work but its continuation in new hands and hearts that would carry forward the mission of creating a world where talent and character mattered more than economic circumstances, where opportunity was distributed based on potential rather than privilege, and where success was measured by what you contributed to the common good rather than what you accumulated for personal benefit. Her story would continue in every young person who chose education over immediate gratification, every business leader who prioritized purpose alongside profit, and every individual who decided that their own good fortune was meaningful only when it became a platform for lifting others toward their own possibilities for transformation. The rags to riches story that had captured public imagination was really a story about the riches to purpose transformation that represented the highest use of privilege and the deepest expression of human potential. Maya Rodriguez Hartford had learned that being rescued from poverty was only the beginning of the story. The real adventure lay in using that rescue as inspiration to help others write their own tales of triumph over limitation, hope over despair, and love over fear. And somewhere in the city, in classrooms and community centers funded by the foundation, in boardrooms where Hartford Industries continued to demonstrate that business could be a force for good, in policy meetings where Maya's advocacy had helped expand access to education and opportunity, the ripples of that one night's courage continued to spread, creating new possibilities for people who might never know the name of the woman whose character had been revealed in flames, but whose legacy would burn bright in the lives she had helped to transform. Your own rags to riches story is still being written, shaped by the choices you make when faced with opportunities to help others, the courage you show when confronted with injustice, and the vision you hold for a world where everyone's potential can be realized regardless of where their journey begins. Maya's story reminds us that transformation is always possible, that character revealed in crisis can open doors to unimaginable opportunities, and that the greatest riches are found not in what we accumulate for ourselves, but in what we contribute to the flourishing of others. The fire that changes everything might be burning right now, waiting for someone with the courage to run toward it rather than away, to choose compassion over comfort, and to discover that in saving others, we often save ourselves.